Evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to it's a single continued hearing this evening from our August agenda, and it is case, what's the number?
4622.
4622. Thank you, Nick. Nick takes care of the facts. I just do the showbiz part. Case 4622, 135 North State Street, RN Neighborhood Residential District. Since it's a continued case, I won't read through the entire agenda item. I'll assume everyone knows what it's all about. So we'll take up where we left off. I'm going to consider the hearing not a new hearing, but it will not have reached the point where we've closed the public testimony, so we will take testimony from the appellant first, then solicit testimony from anyone in the audience who would like to speak, and then go through our usual procedure of discussing things with code enforcement and allowing a factual clarification if that seems appropriate, and then we will consider the case and act on it. You will remember that this is a case concerning a request to overturn a ruling on the part of the Code Enforcement Office concerning the uses that are taking place at this particular address. So, Ms. Obed-Puck, are you ready to come on up and say hi?
Got water this time, because last time I had a little tickle in my throat.
Yeah, it's a hazard.
I do have a question for clarification on the procedure as you just explained it. You're going to allow members of the public to comment after so will we have another chance to respond? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
My name is Kelly Ovett-Puck. I'm an attorney with Soloway & Hollis.
And you're still going to tell the truth and nothing but?
I'm still going to tell the truth and nothing but the truth.
Okay.
And me as well, thank you.
And I represent the applicant, 135 NSS LLC, which is the owner. And as before, I have with me the principal of the owner, Fred Potter. And with that, we have a PowerPoint that Fred would like to run through.
Okay.
So I want to thank you for your courtesy in allowing us to do that while we're all a little fresher and mindful of everybody's time and that we've taken another day out of your week. I thought I'd put it here so everything's here and it will be self-contained in time. So members of the board, if it's okay with you, I'll move relatively quickly, but if you want to stop me and ask questions about anything, very happy to do that so we can go forward. First of all, I thought it was helpful to put this in perspective. This is a 150-year-old project that we're dealing with, and what I've done there is shown a timeline, and the blue line reflects the period of time prior to the adoption of Concord's current zoning ordinance. And in those timelines, we show the completion of the various integrated parcels. There are really two. It's the 125 North State Street property, which was formerly a residence built for a Civil War officer a considerable period of time ago. And then 135 North State Street, which is the Rollins Court Mansion and its associated carriage house. That's the primary focus this evening, and that's where we're talking about zoning relief. So those are the green and red flags, the construction dates. And then we come along and see that the Rollins Court Mansion was acquired by the Roman Catholic Bishop of Manchester, and he established the St. Peter's Church there. And so the buildings were occupied for church uses, originally the mansion and the carriage house. And the mansion and carriage house continue to be used for church and community uses, and the offices and the residences for the professionals associated with that ministry, while the large auditorium was built, and then following that, the parish hall in several additions over a number of years. Most of those additions occurred in the 1950s, as are shown there. And then if you continue down the timeline, you'll see that the red star is when the St. Peter's Church started that stream of uses. The green star is when 125 became used for office and meeting space. Among the firms that were there is a firm I knew when I came to town as Cleveland Waters and Bass. And then, of course, RSA 674 was enacted certainly before 1984, and shortly after that, the Concord Zoning Ordinance was adopted. And then we go on out and we see in 2014 the St. Peter's property was listed for sale. So if we turn to the next page, when the Roman Catholic bishop listed the property for sale, KV Realty Management, and I'll refer it just as KidsVax if that's okay, which is the manager of these properties, KV Realty Management, proposed the plan on the left, and we were acquiring the property and expanding its community uses and integrating the office spaces with our office space. And so there's quite a bit of work there that shows the integration that was proposed. The Roman Catholic Bishop of Manchester, having experienced the outcomes of the result of the church, Sacred Heart Church, determined it was his sense of spiritual ministry that the community would be better served if the auditorium itself were demolished. And hence John Shorelian proposed a pocket neighborhood. That was an idea he had floated before Concord for a number of years. And the focus there, this is sort of a West Coast idea, a very intentionally drawn neighborhood focused around a green, and you'll see that there. That first proposal was a 10-unit condominium. It encompassed the entire property that formerly was St. Peter's Church, and the focus then, as it is now, is around the green in the center. So those competing ideas continued, they went back and forth, and that's why you'll see, those of you who are on the zoning board at that time, you may recall a number of hearings. At one point, Fred, KV Realty was the proponent. At one point, John Shorelian was, but John, as a practical matter, handled all the zoning work in the early days there. And what we ended up with is this overall development plan as shown on the plan as actually approved and then stamped. And the reason for this plan is to reflect the fact that this is a highly integrated development involving two properties, now three. The 125 North State Street property, which is where our original office building was, the 131 North State Street Rollins Court property, which is where the now 8 condominiums are, again, built around a village green, and then the 135 North State Street property, which is the retained community uses and the office use, and you heard our KV fellows, 2 of the 3 who've been hired so far, who spoke last week about their residence there in the mansion. The purple lines there reflect the development and the tying of the properties together. This sort of diagonal right to left purple-pink line is a data conduit and connections that connect the 2 office buildings. The other purple section there is a portion of the stormwater treatment facility, and it is a monstrous facility. I didn't bore you with the entire design of that, but some of you around will recall this was really a major undertaking in which the city planning office said, if you're going to work there, we need to redo the stormwater treatment, and it's treatment that really captures the entire block. So it's 125 where we are, 20 Franklin Street, which is a residence on Franklin Street, sort of in the lower left-hand corner, 22 Franklin Street. And behind those spaces were parking areas that were used for the church ministry. The green diagonal or rectangular box down there reflects the fact that the pocket neighborhoods gardens, which you will see in a picture in just a minute, are actually built on land owned by 20 Franklin Street, which is a property that I acquired before I actually acquired 125 North State Street. At the time, parking was a concern, and we acquired access to that portion of the parking when we started working on 125. For almost 20 years, there have been various plans for 125 to replace the aging stair tower that was built by the state of New Hampshire when it has offices in those buildings, and make it safe. That stair tower is now collapsing, and it's actually the need to proceed with that portion of the development that triggered the set of events which led us to this time today. And then going the other way, as city looked at this, towards the end, they determined that data and power should come from Church Street, that's the smaller green line, and then that the access for the Pocket neighborhood community along the northerly side of the Pocket neighborhood, the big green lines should come along there, and directed that there would be one-way traffic flow in through Church Street and out through North State Street. And the Pocket neighborhood didn't have room for visitor parking, so we also granted an easement for 2 visitor spaces on the 135 North State Street lot. So here's a balancing of all the factors that made this project work. We can go to the next page, and I know you're familiar with this, but back in 2010, this is what it looked like. The parish, when they evacuated most of the daytime uses of that auditorium, that's the auditorium in the front, in the middle, and then the parish house behind that, really compressed the community uses more towards the mansion and the carriage house, where they continued, among other things, food pantry and other community ministries. But that was evacuated some period ago, before the property was listed for sale. That was managed by Norton Asset Management, and you'll know that firm, I'm sure, from its statewide reputation, and Norton very carefully preserved all use rights through the management of this. So the activity really began around 2019. I think in 2018, the zoning work began. John Shorelian contracted with the Roman Catholic Bishop of Manchester. Whether or not he was successful in the development, he would demolish the auditorium, and that would affect what the bishop felt was a proper spiritual management of the community, that is to remove that reminder that particular auditorium no longer existed. For me, that was a tragedy, because it was, in my view, a beautiful building, but that wasn't my decision, and I understand and respect why he did that, but that was the direction he took the project. And now in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see where we were as of last year. An 8 cottage pocket community focused on the village green in the middle, with gardens located in the back of our 20 Franklin Street property. And at this point in time of this picture, we had completed the mansion renovations, but we're working on the carriage house. So if we come forward to the recent timeline, you'll see all of this is occurring while the zoning ordinance is in effect, of course. And we have, and just before 2018, John Shorelian's agreement with the bishop, and then there were 5 steps of construction. The first was our building a long-standing conference room at 125, then the commencement of 131 Rollins Court, then number 3, we started the mansion renovation, number 4, we worked on the carriage house preservation, and number 5, the stair tower and elevator and an office addition at 125. It was really that last step that drew the attention of the new residents in the cottage neighborhood, and they were very concerned because they were not aware of any of the master plans surrounding all of this development. So they filed a zoning appeal trying to stop the addition at 125, and basically said, among other things, that we were building a convention center located in 2 buildings on North State Street, and that our rights to proceed with the development had lapsed. As to 125, it was clear, and I think Mr. Hall spoke yesterday on investigation, it's clear we're not building a convention center. That has never been an intention, but that determination was made by counting chairs in the 2 buildings and adding them all up. And it also was determined that some of the other objective uses were not the case, and the 125 North State Street development, the step 5 rights were fully vested. Among other considerations is that is the expenditure of over $130,000 on the stormwater treatment plant and other work, which was part of the preparation for that stair tower replacement, which now has become critical because of our handicap accessibility commitments and the fact that that building now is in a state of collapse. So, next page, that's why we're here. The Rollins Court neighbors wanting to limit any changes around their pocket neighborhood, the imagining of future problems, and the incomplete understanding of the permitting history. And I found it incredible to believe, and the planning board actually had some questions wondering why the Rollins Court community members weren't aware of the overall plans, but I accept the fact that they believe that they were not told at the time and they were not aware of them when they moved into the property.
Fred, quick interruption. On the issue with 125, that's obviously not what we're here for. But
Yes, what we're here for.
so code, side, so to speak, sided with you on.
Yes.
But was that a concern about use, that were the neighbors concerned that your use on 125 exceeded what your variance was for?
Yes, that's what they articulated.
Okay.
But we don't need to go over the merits of that because we're
Okay.
here.
Yeah.
I don't want to bring up other issues,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I
yeah.
think at the time, the neighbors had hired a law firm. They had come up with everything they could. It was very creative, and we see a little bit of that in the testimony you heard today. It's just whatever we could imagine, throw it out there, and one of these things may stick.
But it was an issue with use. Okay, that's
Yeah,
it.
it was a use issue and the convention center idea, which on examination, it's clear that's not the case.
Okay.
So we're here because of this concern that the neighbors were not aware of the plan that brought the neighborhood into being to start off with. But I think it's important to note what we're not here for. First of all, the convention center, Mr. Hall has reviewed that specifically. It's not the case. We're aware of no complaints about actual uses other than one truck being parked on one Saturday evening, and that was brought to our attention recently. And we have addressed that particular question. It was not our truck. No complaints about actual uses, no actual parking problems, no noise or other problems. The actual facts do not support the imagined future problems. There just haven't been any problems. And you saw the parking counts and so on. Most of the time, our parking lots are half empty. And in the last year, we've not been aware of a single time when there was on-street parking required for any of our 125 North State Street uses, and rarely for the Church Street uses.
The parking counts were in our presentation from last week, which hopefully you all have.
So what have we seen in the course of this hearing? We've seen broad community support. You have a series of letters there coming from other abutters, including my wife and myself. We're one of the owners in the Pocket community. We have two longtime residents that have been there throughout the entire history, 40 and 50 years. They've confirmed that non-conforming uses have been reduced as a result of all this, not expanded. One of those is the Hutton family property, which is a spectacular property at the corner of Church Street and North State Street. The other of which is Bill Champney, who has owned property on that street for a long time. He actually grew up in the neighborhood. Two of the real estate professionals have given their professional view that the impact of this has a positive impact on neighborhood residential values, not speaking the commercial values, and the general livability of the neighborhood. And then you heard the testimony of people who actually live there and the community life that this affords. So back to the opposition. We heard last week, and to my knowledge, there still is no opposition letters from the community, and one witness made comments in opposition.
Go ahead. Thanks.
And this is an example of, you received, I think, a very effective appellate argument, which takes the facts and presents them in a way that's intended to have an outcome. And here it is, that I've installed traffic control devices because I anticipate there's going to be a large volume of traffic for my businesses, so I want them to go in a certain pattern. That is our driveway. He has put these signs on. So what is those traffic control devices? We go to the next page, we'll see what they are. They're actual signs. So we see sort of the feeling of this. To my mind, those are signs. I wouldn't call them traffic control devices, but the wording doesn't matter, but it just shows the tilt that we've got. And let's go on to the next paragraph. As to that particular topic, the next page, I'm sorry, thank you. Here's why they're there. This is the planning board approved plan, and you'll see circled in red is the requirement from city planners and traffic control folks that this be one-way traffic. I installed the signs even though Mr. Shorelian had been obligated to do it, but it wasn't done. You'll see red circle. A do not enter sign was required to get the planning board approval. We have installed less obtrusive signs that have been, as I can see it, apparently 100% effective. we're trying to stop people not familiar with the neighborhood from driving up that street into the pocket neighborhood. People accessing this building drive around the block and they come in from Church Street. And we're aware of nobody who's gone contrary to that pattern. In fact, over half of the uses there have been my own use, and we've personally directed people, and that use pattern, thankfully, has been established. I highlight the yellow line across because that's where the lot line is. And so when you see the expression that I installed signs on their driveway, this is actually our driveway. We share it with them. There's an easement across, but the driveway is on the 135 North State Street property. So I had sort of a feeling that we had done an awful thing by doing these parking lines, just listening to the testimony. But to help you see, this is really an appellate argument. These signs are there in order to comply with the guidance of the city planners. I think we can go to the next page. I think similarly, the debate about the racing simulators are not being racing machines is another red herring. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But it doesn't and shouldn't justify rezoning. And then the next point, which we'll step through a couple of examples of this, at every step, contrary to the innuendo, KB Realty has been fully transparent, made sure that the city planning department and the zoning folks involved were fully aware of what our contemplated use were, and to make sure it was properly permitted. Next page is an example. You recall the early stages of this, John Shorelian handled the zoning permitting process. And so that's the reason why some of the testimony was shaped the way it was. I came and testified to specific points when asked questions in the course of the way. But John really handled the testimony. From 1978 forward, 2018 forward, I'm in the wrong century. So it's 150 years old, but this project hasn't been quite that long, although for some of you on the board it may feel that way. We've been here a lot of times. But when we were ready to take over the property, we came back just to double check that all these things were still in effect and displayed the current plans for the project and made sure that we were in compliance. And that was a determination at this time. And this is an example of the activity that was going on. There was an effort to minimize the burden on everybody through the process and make sure things worked. So here's an example of Kelly confirming all the zoning relief is still in effect. It still applies notwithstanding the change in the footprint, and it still applies to the uses that we have presented.
Mr. Potter?
Yes.
At the time in 2019 when you gave them these plans to look at, what was in the carriage house?
The time in the carriage house, as the first carriage house has been, so the yoga mats were still there, so we're going to come to that in just a minute. Okay. But there were two conference rooms on the second floor. There was a garage on the first floor, and there was a community room on the first floor. There's been some confusion about the community room. I don't think anybody has a concern about that, but that's basically half the first floor is a gathering space with games and a little kitchen. It's what we call the community room. And at the time that John was going to own that, he had contemplated that this would be a gathering space for residents of Rawlins Court. So from the very beginning, this building had been seen as used by other folks in the community.
What is it used for now?
The same thing, but there is a change. And do you want to do it here, or I can go to the next page?
No, you go ahead in your own.
Do your thing.
So I'm glad to answer the question.
So I just want to point out this correspondence between me and Craig Walker was provided to you, including the plans that I sent him. So you should have those. We didn't include them. They're multiple pages, so we didn't include them in the PowerPoint, but you should have them.
And David emailed them to us earlier today.
Thank you.
So we have them.
So just to remind everybody, there was no hiding the ball. I know several here have seen these plans multiple times. But I think the concern is the current plans. So the next page talks about that if you'd like. But we'll address it at any point you want. So before we proceeded with the carriage house renovations, we had to go back again. And the reason for that was when we started renovating the carriage house, to the surprise of everybody, and I believe to John Shorelian as well, it was in a state of structural collapse. When we opened up the walls, we discovered if we were going to preserve the exterior And we have residents, and some of the folks are here in the room, who actually chose their cottages so they could look out on the silhouette of the carriage house. This carriage house was about to collapse, and we were stuck with a problem. So we had come back with the possibility of rebuilding the everything from the scratch, much like the Pocket neighborhood. It demolished the church building and then built the Pocket neighborhood, of rebuilding the carriage house and imitating the lines, which we would have been able to do. But there was very strong public sentiment for keeping that as an historic property, like the mansion, although it was clearly less valuable in terms of its historical worth, and opening up to the community. Those things were, we got a strong awareness that that was a strong desire of the community. So we went back, and at that point, we moved the community room, the larger community room, from the second floor to the first floor. So that's back to your question. So now on the first floor, and I think the plans showing both are there. This is the second floor plan. The first floor is now community room plus large meeting room in place of the garages that were there. And the second floor is this room with the two simulators in it, the golfing simulators and the racing simulators. So this was presented again through the zoning process, and we confirmed again, because we're about to make a very significant decision point. Are we trying to preserve the shell? And what that required was completely gutting the interior and building a steel skeleton, which you can't see if you go there today. We had to preserve the roof. The roof had been structurally defective when it was built, and it would not withstand any loads on the second floor. So it had been unsafe from the point of construction under current standards. It was a wonderful building. I'm not trying to denigrate the building, but it was simply not safe and could not have people load on the second floor. It was designed for hay and for the storage of carriages. So we were at that decision point again. We came back to the city again and said, we need to make better use of the building. Here's the proposal. We actually have the yoga mats. I'd purchased the yoga mats, but we found no interest in yoga in that building. And I think you can look at some of our residents and see this is really something in terms of team building, office team building, the Business Finance Authority and the mansion. This was a big draw for them because they have a major commitment to team building of their own people and their clients. So this was the set of plans that was before the zoning group and planning group at the time that the project was considered for 79E qualification, which we pursued with the city council, and it was unanimously granted. For other technical reasons about the city's lien and so on, we couldn't do that and maintain our financing.
Could I interrupt you with a question?
Yes.
Just a moment.
Certainly.
At the time that you made the change in your design because of the structural problems and you decided not to use the garage, you came back to the board.
We did.
And because you were going to be losing 2 parking spaces as a result of doing it.
Correct.
So that happened, did that happen prior to the planning board approvals?
No, but the planning board, we went to them on the CUP relief to not have to build the parking lot that was, the parking that was in the front lawn and the corridor. Now, we understand they can make us build that parking. Right. But we're managing it so it's not a problem because neither we nor our neighbors want us to tear up the front lawn.
So
can I just respond?
yeah, sure, go.
I'll respond. I think I can probably clarify. So what happened was these structural issues were discovered. Fred was trying to decide whether to demolish the carriage house and rebuild it, or whether there was a way that he could save the exterior of the structure and kind of restructure the interior to work. So the correspondence that you've been provided and that's referenced here, and the plans that were submitted to Planning and Zoning and Matt Walsh were prior to being before the ZBA. So we went to planning, we went to zoning, we said we're trying to evaluate the options. What do you think about these plans? What will we need for additional zoning relief if we pursue restructuring the space? And that was what precipitated us coming to zoning to ask for the relief on the parking.
Wait, I thought, so the zoning meetings were in June and September of 2018.
I think when she's saying zoning, she means Craig Walker, the zoning office, and not always the board.
Okay,
Sorry,
that's okay.
sorry.
Sorry, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, the early ones were 2018, 2019 on the original plans. Then they went to planning board, got subdivision and site plan approval, mostly for Rollins Court. There wasn't much site plan approval that was needed for the mansion lot. And then started construction. Once they kind of got into it and they started construction, Fred realized structurally he couldn't do what he had been intending to do. And then he came back to the zoning board in 2020
Right.
and said, we need more
that
parking relief. Coming back, and that specific request was made with input from planning and zoning, which is reflected in the correspondence that we provided to you. Does that make sense?
But when you came back in 2020, you didn't say you needed more parking because you were going to rent the fitness room in the community center to the public, right?
No, that's absolutely true. It was because we were pulling the parking out of the carriage house.
Okay.
Right.
Nope, that's
So-
absolutely true.
My question is, I saw this language in the 79E report. I have not seen this language in any document that was before this board saying that the community center and the fitness center would be rented to anyone or used by anyone other than the occupants of the buildings or the occupants of Rollins Court. Can you point me to anything that says that?
I can point you to years of conversations, and I can only do it with this, years of conversations with the zoning department in which we asked for everything we needed to do. And Craig Walker would confirm verbally, he's had some issues why he can't do it tonight, but he would confirm that he had known that we were renting from the very beginning, that there would be public rentals. At the time this project was undertaken, Legacy-wise, which is the future occupant of that building, didn't even have its technology platform built. So we knew it would be rental for some indefinite period of time, but there never was any thought in my mind, and there actually was repeated reference to the fact that we will be renting this property to the public, continuing the community uses, which were the church uses on this site, for an extended period of time until we fully occupy the building. And we didn't even know when or if that would ever occur. So throughout the process, we presented everything we intended to do, including the rental, and this is an example of it. Of course, Craig, the preceding email to this, which we can send you, is us sending to Craig and Matt, here's the whole series, here's this, we're going to be renting, what do we need to do, if anything else? And I just pulled this out
I
because
would
there
like to
is
see that email.
a written record that shows that indeed the rentals were known and discussed in connection with the meetings that led to the zoning hearing that you're talking about, which is the one thing we were told to do, come back here for the parking. But the rental concept was there, disclosed, it had been there from the beginning.
So,
So just to respond for a minute, so that the 79E report that Matt Walsh submitted to City Council was provided to Planning and Zoning, and
And by that you mean Craig.
Craig Walker, Heather Shank,
Yep.
both departments, which disclosed in there in writing. There were definitely discussions with Craig, but as far as what's in writing, that's a place that it was disclosed, and it's in the email correspondence that you were provided to show that they were aware that there was a contemplated limited use for the rentals for the public. There are also references, and I can find the specific planning, the specific minute references in a minute. That didn't make any sense, but I can.
I understand what you're saying.
But there's references that the public use would not be a significant public use, which I think we did say that, and I think those are reflected either in the hearing, transcribed hearing, the transcribed minutes from the hearing, or the minutes.
you're talking about the zoning hearings?
Yes, the zoning hearings. So I think our point is Craig had already made a determination that we didn't need additional zoning relief. He was aware that that was a contemplated use and specifically advised us on the relief that was needed.
And that was before you came back to see us about the parking?
Yes.
That was, it was in between, those
This
emails were from
correspondence
2019.
was when we went back in anticipation of the changes to the carriage house. We consulted with the planning department and with the zoning department, Craig Walker, to say, this is what our plans now look like. Here's the 79E report. There were discussions with Craig, and Craig never said to us, oh, if you're gonna use this for public rentals, and that's because this had been contemplated all along.
So when Sam Durfee wrote this email to you, I think it's, yeah, this is the June 26th, 2019 email saying that he talked over with Craig, and based on the floor plans, it's similar enough for the variances to remain effective. That was, you took that reasonably enough to be code enforcement saying, as well as engineering, that this is consistent with.
That the plans were consistent
Okay.
at that time.
We'll get back to
That's not on the public use. So that was the earlier discussion, and so I don't want to misrepresent that because.
So the public use was not part of that?
At that time, the issue was, we've had a number of iterations of zoning relief, and the last iteration was John coming before this board and saying, oh, we're gonna use the carriage house for residences. And I wanted to confirm that the zoning relief that had been granted for the accessory uses was still good and wasn't completely superseded. So.
Residences.
Yeah, so at one
In
point,
between, there's the carriage house and the mansion were gonna be converted to 4 more condominiums.
Yes.
John had a plan for that, and you had acted on that, so that was why we're
Yes.
concerned that, did that erase all the
the
stuff that had been
prior
done?
zoning relief that had been granted, that,
I can't imagine how anybody got confused over this.
I know, it's very confusing.
So, I'm trying to,
There is a chronology in the prior PowerPoint, which is, I have to go back and look at it all the time, so.
in one of these 2019 emails, somebody, I can't remember if it's you or someone from the city, references a rental, I think.
It's right there, it's actually on the board right there.
Yeah,
So
Which,
it's the lower right-hand corner where Matt's writing, and
October 30th?
he summarizes our intended uses, and that's actually a fairly good statement.
Oh, it's in the, so, and you're saying that's consistent with what you had disclosed even before the 2018 variances, but there's nothing at that meeting, at the meeting in front of us, where it was specifically disclosed to us, right?
I think that's probably correct. See, from my perspective, this had always been part of the plan.
Right.
John Shorelian is handling zoning presentations, and the focus there was, the real issue here is very tight residential living being dropped into a small lot. It doesn't comply with anything. The buildings are too big, the density is too big, the driveways aren't wide enough. It's a genius idea. The focus is on the green, so the buildings are pushed back to both neighbors, and the focus is on the green. And you see the list of variances there. It's a huge number of variances. So John was managing, and fairly, he was open about things as well. So Fred's coming at this from a community use perspective. John's coming at it from a pocket neighborhood, which he's wanted to build for decades. And until Kelly came in to confirm all these things, John was driving the train as to variance presentations. City planning and zoning knew the uses we had in mind, including the continuation of the church uses. Those have been negotiated with the Roman Catholic Bishop of Manchester, knew the public uses, but those were what had been forever, and we were just making it dramatically smaller. So when we came back to actually buying things, Kelly came along and said, okay, just checking in, and Mr. Carley, to your point, because there was an intervening here in which all the mansion became residential. And so did that erase everything? And the answer was no. And then when we came back because of structural issues, we went in with the final set of plans, well, they're not exactly as built because HVAC needed to move a sink and that kind of thing. But they're substantially as finally built. And as you see, the yoga mats aren't there, the racing simulators are. But all this to say is it had been an open book the whole time. Planning, zoning, life safety, utility maintenance, where the sewers had to go. And all of these lines on this project were drawn in as we progressed based upon the needs as expressed to us by the professionals.
Wasn't there somewhere in the presentation that was made to us in the minutes, and if I've got this wrong, I apologize, a reference to the meeting spaces and the exercise room being used by either the tenants or the owners of the residences or the people in the mansion?
Yes, and 125 North State Street, because those are integrated properties from our perspective.
Right,
But yes.
but not, at that time, there wasn't any mention made of rent going out on the outside?
I think that's correct. I look at the minutes, and I think you're correct on the minutes.
Okay.
Can I ask another question? Sorry to, so the carriage, the first floor of the carriage house, that's the community room, right?
There are two rooms there, the community room, which is pretty much the way it always was, either under John's plans, and then a large meeting room.
Okay. Is that available to the people who live in the pocket community?
Well,
Oh, no, no.
it's no longer part of the contractual relationship. We actually want to make it available to people, and the people in the pocket community have inquired about using it for family events, and we've said yes. So it's available, but it's available the same way as other members of the public. That is, it's not part of the contractual.
Because it's a different lot, different owners, there's obviously a history, but that's not part of their HOA fees or anything like that?
No.
That they can use
Correct.
that?
No.
It's just kind of a informal,
You know, from my perspective, it's more than informal, but yes, you're right, there's no contractual right to come into that building by the pocket community neighbors.
So what room is this?
That is the large meeting room. As you look at the carriage house, it's the room to the right,
So it's on the first floor,
on the first floor.
and it's the one that's being advertised for weddings.
Yes.
and how many people can fit in there?
We have a limit of 50 for events.
Okay.
We have 95 chairs that we showed for life safety. We were required to show what's the maximum number of chairs you can fit in there, and that was a life safety analysis, and those were the counts that led to the neighbors saying we're building a convention center. So they counted the chairs. There were also two other conference rooms that could have a lot of chairs in them too. So that's how you get to this 400. There's no concept that is how this building will be used. In fact, it can't be used that way now. As you see, and I appreciate Mr. Hall's willingness to go back and take a look, we can't fit that number of chairs in there if we wanted. We've got, the floor plans are taken up by the simulator equipment, pretty much.
And anyone can rent the golf, the cars, the room.
Well, they have to go through a reservation system. It's not public. You can't show up and go into the building.
Sure.
Yeah,
But if I make a reservation, I could rent it.
yes.
We tripped you up there. You were in process.
mid-
Oh, and I, just out of respect for your time, I know you know the arguments. These are my, but I don't, you can read faster than I can speak, so I want to save your time. So they're right there.
I would like to see the emails with Craig Walker discussing the rental of the space. Did you say you had those?
I don't know, we have an email, I frankly don't know that that's the case.
Okay.
I was-
No,
I
I
do know
don't,
that-
we
that
don't,
Matt's
I
summary-
don't believe we have an email with Craig Walker discussing the rental of the space.
Okay.
It is in this, the report to the mayor.
Yeah, it's in the
references-
report to the
The
mayor that he
subject
was
clearly
included
was
on.
discussed. We were in a joint meeting with
And-
Craig and Matt, but that's typical of all the meetings. The signage has been through the architectural design review. All these things were going on at the same time. So there's been no secret about this, but I think you're correct in saying, I don't know we're gonna have something that says, kaboom, here's the public rental program.
Okay. Thank you.
How so, have you ever had a wedding? Have you had any weddings there?
Ironically, we have had one wedding, and David Hall has seen it. Now, this is the funny part about it. There were 4 guests, the groom and the bride, which you might expect, the photographer,
It's not much of a party without it.
and one other friend. The people who were being married were one of the student residents of the mansion. So it's just kind of funny that that's the irony of that. We have had other events. The maximum event, I think, as we've gone back and looked at the records, is 35. The building's really suitable for no more than 50.
I mean, how critical is it to your overall business I mean, you obviously have very high-end office space. You have a couple of businesses that you intend to use the space for once you're fully ramped up. You've got the live, work, residence. So you've got a lot going on. How critical is it to your business to get revenue from, or income from renting it out for meetings or events?
It's essential for maintaining the historic preservation of those buildings. They are extraordinarily expensive to build and to maintain. So it's a key element. The revenues beyond the office rental, they don't support it. And the student rentals, these students are here, their occupancy is part of their, or these postgraduate professionals are here. The occupancy is part of their internship, in which they're paid a very modest, almost embarrassingly low sum. But they're also building community. They're here for a transition training, mentoring, 2-year launch into professions. So they're really not able to subsidize this building. And the Business Finance Authority, the building was specifically built with large numbers of common areas to echo back to the resident side. So those of you who've been inside the building, you've seen this is a remarkable historic preservation of the Governor Rollins Mansion. So you can come in there and you can understand how it was used by the family. But those uses, the large kitchen, the dining room, the boat room on the 3rd floor, those uses are not rentable uses. So not rentable uses for an office occupant. They are ancillary to that. So the Business Finance Authority came there because the team building, as I mentioned, it's really critical to their location decision. Those kind of uses are important for the program to work and us to be able to maintain these properties.
Thank you.
Questions, other questions of the board? Nick, do you have any questions? Any other questions, Laura? All set, Andrew? Is there more you'd like us to know?
I think what I'll do is I'll wait and hear what we have for public comments, and then maybe I'll make a final rebuttal statement,
Kelly, sorry.
unless anyone has any questions.
There was one, you read a quote, I think it was from Craig at the 2018 meeting that you placed some importance on. If you have that handy, or if not, maybe when you come back, could you, because I wasn't following your thread when you read it before, but now that I have the bigger picture,
I think it was
understand what the relevance
respect
was.
probably to the live-work concept.
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll find that for you.
thanks.
Yep, I'm glad to do that. Does anybody else have any more questions before we step down?
No, I don't think so.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would anyone like to be heard in favor of this appeal? Please come forward. I gather the person who put his hand up would like to be heard in opposition. You can be heard either way. Come on up. Swear to tell the truth and nothing but.
I do.
Would you give us your name, please?
Charles Ketcher.
And where do you live, Mr. Kesher?
I live at Rollins Court, unit number 3.
Okay.
So,
C-A-T-H?
yeah, just like a baseball catcher.
Okay.
I wanted to make a few comments. My wife and I moved in 2020 when most of the 7 of us moved in late June of 2020. First, I'd like to comment on what was represented to us as what the pocket neighborhood would be and what would be surrounding the area. We found out, we were late into one of the last residents, we found out in September 2019 there was a unit available. And we met with Mr. Chorlian at that time. Did not have any knowledge of Mr. Potter or the buildings around us. What we were initially presented prior to that by a realtor was there was the potentiality for an open space in the mansion. So this was in 2019. We were told that the mansion potentially was going to be split into 2 units, and would my wife and I be interested in purchasing one of the units. There was no mention of additional events, usage of the mansion, at least presented to us. In terms of the carriage house, what was presented to us was there was potentially the intention to have some space, again, it was very non-specific, and potentially a fitness area. Fitness area described, as we talked about last week, more fitness, exercise machines, et cetera. And that residents, hopefully, of our pocket neighborhood could utilize that. So that's how it was presented initially. So in 2019 September, after some of these variances were discussed at the ZBA, we were presented with the possibility of only this unit. And we signed a very lengthy P&S, and it talked about the bishop, it talked about the bishop's goals when he sold the land, how it got sold to Mr. Chorley and not others based on some questions. And there's a very large P&S document from the church to John Chorley that describes what the property could not be used for. It's very explicit, and we've actually, my wife has been in contact with the office of the bishop because there were some questions about utilization of this property. But in any event, we moved in. We abut the mansion. And so the signage had a little to do, we live right next to North State Street, so going the opposite way to go out was a little inconvenient, but not a big issue. But construction was supposedly to be completed on the mansion and the carriage house within 6 months, and it was very elongated process. We were very patient, and we really, as a pocket neighbor, we didn't make too many complaints, or we just waited for it to be done. So more recently, and again, 125 North State Street existed as an office building. We knew the stairs and the whole situation. We could see it. We have, we're very lucky that what has been established in our neighborhood is we have, there's 8 cottages. There are 6 of us who are actively living there, and we've become fairly helpful with each other. We're very close. We meet on what Mr. Potter describes as a village green weekly. And so part of the discussion, again, this has nothing to do with the ZBA, that we met with the planning board, was 125 and how that impacted upon our neighborhood. The intent was to build a very tall building, relatively tall, that would overlook our village green and over our houses very much. So as homeowners and not part of our HOA, we just asked to meet with the planning board about this. We have 3 officers in the HOA who met several times with Mr. Potter, and we actually were able to form a fairly reasonable compromise to what that office building would be. Initially, it was really going to overlook much of our neighborhood.
You're talking about the one on the corner of Franklin.
Exactly,
Okay.
Nothing to do with this, but.
It's really not something
Right.
we can wrestle with, so.
Right, and
in the interest of efficiency, if we could get back to the other side of the
Right,
lot,
but
that would be
the,
great.
the reason I bring that up is that is not what prompted our complaints to Mr. Hall or the code officer. That's why I bring that up. The comment has been made. It was because of that we then complained, and that this brought the code officer into the situation. That's the only reason I bring it up, not to comment on why it exists or not. One had nothing to do with the other, and I think that's a very important distinction to make. But ultimately, that was what we were presented as homeowners, is what would exist. Now, we ended up seeing this letter that Mr. Hall has written, and the only additional comment I have to make is my understanding is when that letter is sent, that activity theoretically needs to cease and desist. You cannot use that facility if it falls outside the variance. Am I correct? Is that a correct assumption?
You'd have to ask Mr. Hall. I'm not sure exactly what the procedure
There
is.
is a notification process that continues with any, help me here, with any violations that I find. So it's very seldom do I issue an immediate cease and desist for something of that nature. it went straight to appeal process, and I was gonna let the
All right.
ZBA go through that process.
And then ultimately, if one has grievances, it goes as a grievance to,
Right, there's a whole process to go through, depending on what happens tonight, you'll have options to say,
so in summary, I think my main point was, was not something that was prompted by another process. This was something that none of us had any understanding of, were not really told. And if you go by the dates of 2018 and 2019 with these variances, it was clearly not as concrete as it seemed to be presented.
So were you part of the group of people who had contacted code enforcement and said that you thought something was going on in the carriage house that shouldn't be?
Yes, there was.
What prompted you to do that? I'm not clear on that.
What prompted us to do that is if you looked at the governor's center and we went back to the variances, it didn't seem to coincide with what the variances were allowing. We did the research and we went back to what the mansion and the carriage house were allowed for usage, and it did not seem consistent with what that usage was.
What were you seeing that wasn't consistent?
The events, basically, we had seen the golf. We had early on seen the golf. Mr. Potter gave us a tour of the mansion and the carriage house. We had seen the golf simulators, and I play golf, so I know what golf simulators represent and what they are. We were told about the automobile simulators. We were warned because they had to basically close down the driveway to put these things into the mansion, and they affected some of the neighbors who lived, so we knew of them. But that's really what prompted it, is we were concerned about it was outside the zone, or excuse me, it was outside what had been said. In addition, there were several steps during this process that Mr. Potter had come to us seeking additional ways to improve the parking, or access to parking, where he mentioned the gardens, where we have 4 raised beds. There was a discussion that he wanted to get an easement behind that so he could access the place on 125 with, I believe it was 10 Bradley Street. There was a home on 10 Bradley Street he purchased, and so he was looking, and he wanted us to grant him an easement. At that point, we felt that it was not in our best interest.
And that was connected somehow with the carriage house?
Well, it had to do with because 125 goes to the carriage house, goes to the mansion. It's the how they get there, part of.
I mean, the circulation on the site. Okay.
Exactly, because otherwise they have to cut straight through our development to get from 125 to 135. Or they can walk around on North State Street.
Okay. Is there anything else you'd like to
No,
say?
that's all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who'd like to be heard? Please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Farrell. Nick Holmes again. I swear. Nick Holmes, 131 North State Street, Unit 7. I just thank you for listening to me last week. I have a few points that I would like to make, just very briefly. In response to your question about what prompted us to raise this concern with Mr. Hall, the initial plans for 125 North State Street were a 4-story office addition that would be within 10 feet of our property line, our fence, overlooking our common green. That caused us some concern. We met with the planning officials. We saw the floor plans. It looked like it was a convention center. What really prompted our concern about the carriage house was I then went on the website. I found out that there was a website for the Governor's Center, and I saw that this was being advertised. And I saw it was being advertised on their website. I found the press releases.
This was the carriage house.
The carriage house. I saw that it was being advertised on Facebook. And this is in the middle of the pandemic, or halfway through the pandemic, we hope. And it caused me concern, as I said last week, about the increased commercialization. If these racing simulators and if the golfing simulator was going to be used by the residents of the mansion, so be it. They have a very nice place to meet. That would be fine. But it was the advertising, the public advertising to everybody else that caused us concern, and that's why we raised it to Mr. Hall. Let me just make my very few points. I would submit to this board that the presentation we heard from the applicant tonight was very different from the presentation we heard last week. Last week, there was an effort to persuade us that racing simulators were a form of exercise machines, and that this wedding venue or the meeting room was a community center. This is not they're not exercise machines. This is not a community center. Nobody from the Pocket neighborhood uses the carriage house. We have not been invited to use it. We've been given a tour, but that's it. I think most importantly, a lot of what we heard from the applicant tonight, was a diversion. There's an issue before this board. There was an issue before Mr. Hall. That issue is, were the variances that John Chorlian obtained in 2018 for an exercise room and a meeting and a community gathering room, were those variances sufficient to allow the use of the space now and the use of the space as it is planned going forward as a commercial center that they can rent out? I would submit that they are not. I respectfully disagree with the applicant on many of the factual statements that he made in his presentation tonight. I'm not going to go through them. I don't think that they're necessary for the board to resolve that issue about whether those 2018 variances are necessary. In closing, I would just again remind the board about the February 15th, 2020 application that I had included in that packet last week. We've heard a lot about what was correspondence in 2019 and 2018 and all of that. This is what the applicant told the board in 2020. He told the board, these spaces in the carriage house are intended to be used as amenities for the office and live-work use of the mansion. That is not how they are being used today. They are being advertised, they are being marketed. The fact that there haven't been problems yet does not change the analysis. We're coming out of a pandemic, his business may take off. I'm trying to prevent further commercialization of my neighborhood where I don't think it is in accordance with the variances that were granted to John Chorlian in 2018.
Questions from the board?
Quickly, so is it true that to date there hasn't been a burden on the parking from the events, but you're concerned based on the marketing that there will be in the future?
Correct. And there have been some impacts on our neighborhood, some noise, some other things. When the racing simulators are going, we can hear them. Things like that. We're not calling up Mr. Hall all the time. We're not filing complaints. We're not that kind of people. But there is, and if it was the fellows that were playing with the racing simulators, so be it. But if this is used and open to the public, and if it takes off, this will have a huge impact on our neighborhood. And you can't have if you have a variance, you have to live by the variance. You can't use it beyond the variance. That's my basic position. If the racing simulators are only used by the fellows, so be it. Great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I thought I saw another hand.
I'm going to retract my hand.
Right? Thank you so much. If what you had to say has been said, then we appreciate your consideration.
And Mr. Crowley, for the record, the other people here are the other residents of Rollinsport that own it. We're unified in this except for the Potters, who
Very
also
good.
own the cottage in Rollinsport.
Thank you. Code enforcement.
Thank you. Just as a point of addressing what Mr. Potter was presenting, might not be in the order he presented it, but the email that they stressed that Sam sent out, and that was part of his presentation, it's in your package. They actually sent this to me. If you look at page 2, I think it's very important that you realize that Attorney Obit Puck told Sam that the community room, fitness rooms, garage storage as accessory uses to an office and live-work use is what was approved. So I wasn't part of the conversations if they had those with Mr. Walker, but interpreting this is what I had to do as a zoning administrator, code officer. I would agree that if that was going to be the use, even though they flipped the first and second floor, that probably didn't change the variances that were granted. I tend to agree with the abutters that the use is quite different. than what I could interpret from reading our minutes, the ZBA minutes.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Because the way your letter is primarily framed around the need for more parking based on these additional uses that you found,
Well, more parking, and obviously the use was not authorized.
So I know that forgot what you called it, public entertainment facility, but is the public assembly, that's also a use that would require a variance, right?
Yes, it would. To that point, so we've had a lot of conversations when this came up as a conversation for 125, the large addition, was it going to be a convention center? I met with Mr. Potter, Kelly over at Park, reviewed the plans, reviewed the numbers as compared to what was granted a variance, and I agreed that that was not going to be a quote-unquote convention center. You know, renting a convention room out or a conference room out to a nonprofit or to another business doesn't make it a convention center. I understand that. I think when they referenced that they were gonna rent these out or rent out the rooms, I think that's what was implied to, well, that's what was implied to me for 125. I don't know what was told to Craig or to the planning board or whatever else when they said we're gonna rent this out. But I do understand that they were gonna rent their conference room out to other businesses that needed to have a larger conference area. I don't have a strong feeling towards that as an F1 business use. What I do have a strong feeling towards, and is a part of my appeal, not my appeal, my letter, is what's happening in the carriage house. That, to me, is more than just an F1 high-end business use, which is, you saw my bullet points from last week addressing that. I have to rely on the ZBA minutes. I can't rely on hallway conversations or what was presented to planning board. It's really the board made decisions here on what variances they could use and for what use, and that is what I try to interpret and enforce.
So what use, F1 is the use that they have?
That's a
If that's
business.
the variance they have, what's the variance someone would need for putting on events?
That'd probably fall under convention or banquet. I'd have to look in our table of uses to see where it falls, but I would not put it under an F1 business use for renting out community space or convention hall or banquet facilities.
But we're not being asked to decide what use it is. We're being asked to decide if the uses that are being made are consistent with the variances that were
Correct.
granted for parking in 2018.
Correct.
Okay.
The COVID-19 restrictions, we've already talked about that. They've mentioned that, you know, that has limited their ability to advertise or to get the businesses that Mr. Potter wants in there. The fellows he wanted to get, luckily for him, he has his four fellows, three fellows on staff, which is what the intent was for the live work, and they would be using all of this amenities in the carriage house. And when I look at the website, which you've seen my pages, as well as the gentleman that lives in the Pocket neighborhood, to me, it just said this is stretching the ability of my interpretation of what they were granted. So that's, the other part of that website is they are selling memberships. And I had a hard time categorizing that in my brain as a business use. Haven't really decided, but that's just all part of my equation. Thank you.
Questions for Mr. Hall? Ms. Obit, would you like to make any comments in response to what you've heard? Please come forward.
Fred, do you have anything specific that you want to respond to?
I don't think particularly. The memberships are a control thing. So this is a limited use facility under any scenario, and sometimes I feel like no good deed goes unpunished. We put up the signage, and that's deemed a problem. We have offered the use to the Pocket neighborhood. We hope they would be among the members and participate in this. We think it's a great place to have a family meal if you have a small cottage. And that use is important to us and important to the community. We are continuing on a much smaller scale what has been going on that parcel for over 50 years. And we intend to continue to do what you've heard so far. There will be no complaints I'm confident because we're going to manage it that way. That's among the jobs of the fellows, to make sure that the community is happy with what we're doing.
Thanks, Fred. First, I'd like to address Mr. Winter's request with respect to the language that I quoted at the last hearing. That was actually at the June 13th hearing, June 13th, 2018. It's at 3:02 it wasn't in the minutes, and that's probably why you couldn't find it, but we actually transcribed the audio. And the board had asked Craig, so the live work reference is in quotes. Is that the applicant made it up, or is it kind of a term of art? Have we seen that anywhere before? Craig says, it is terminology that is regularly used in different aspects. Oftentimes it applies to perhaps an artist that has a studio they live in. It could be a couple of people perhaps living in the residence and working there. You know, we looked at this building here and separated the two uses, the residential use versus the office use, and we calculated the parking separately too. There are other ways perhaps to look at this as, and then it's in parentheses, I'm not sure why. I used the term rooming house, maybe the audio wasn't clear. A rooming house, but it is not a rooming house because those are open to the general public. These residences here are for people working there. It is still two separate uses. And with that, maybe I'll just talk about that live work use first. So this is not a defined term. It is a classification that Craig and the applicant arrived at for a use that would be permitted here. So it lacks full and clear definition. As we've pointed out, it contemplates some kind of coexisting live and work, primarily probably people who, live there and work there, but that can take different forms. As Ms. Spector-Morgan pointed out, and is absolutely true, there were representations made by the applicant that it wouldn't be contemplated to be available for the public. That's reflected in Craig's comments as well. And as a general rule, these spaces are not available to the public. There happened to be a vacant space, and Fred was aware of someone who had a need for housing. The lease runs through next June. He's not advertising this property for rent, for residential use, and he fully contemplates that by next June, when the lease is up, he will have 4 fellows, and he will be able to occupy all 4 spaces. A couple points on that I think are important. The board did not condition that relief on non-rental. So, and I do believe, and I haven't been able to find it, but I do believe that there was some reference to a reduced rental rate for those who occupied it and also worked there. The other important point is that this is largely about parking. Those were the concerns that David Hall raised. And when the parking calculation was done for this building, it actually accounted for somebody living in that space. So it wasn't double counting. It wasn't saying, oh, well, we don't need to have parking for that space because that's someone who lives there. That was factored into the calculation. And we would ask that if the board decides that rental to somebody who is not already working there, either because they work from home or they're working for an employer there, or whatever reason that's not a permitted use, that as suggested by David Hall, we would at least be allowed to let the current tenant live there for the rest of the lease term. So that's my comments on the live use. And then the other major issue is the carriage house and the amenities that are in the carriage house and how they are being used. So first of all, I think that there's been some talk about what exactly is in there, and I think that's a red herring argument, whether it's racing simulators or yoga mats. I think that it's clear that planning and zoning were both informed and on board about how that space was going to be structured and built out by the time it was built. I don't think that is the issue. The issue really is who and how are these spaces being used, not whether we have 8 yoga mats or 4 racing simulators. And if we look at what was approved, those spaces, those fitness spaces, the conference spaces, however we call those spaces, they were approved as amenities that were accessory to the principal use of office and live work. And that is primarily how they're being used. We submitted a lengthy narrative which included some statistics about how those spaces are actually being used, and those spaces are primarily being used by the on-site employees and businesses and residences. There is some minimal use by the public, which is consistent with a business's use of its amenity facilities. So I think last time I was here, I pointed out, you know, my office has conference room space. We have a beautiful atrium space. We frequently allow nonprofits to use that space. We have used spaces for having art showings, but
Do you advertise that space to the public?
no, we don't advertise that space. So that seems to be the main concern, I think.
It is a different arrangement.
So, and as far as the membership interests, we have 4 members of the Governor's Center, which is intended to be marketed primarily as this bundle of business amenities that can be used on an occasional basis if you don't have an exclusive right to use them because you have a membership. Similar again to, you know, if my firm needs conference space in Boston, we can pay for it on an annual basis, on a quarterly basis, and then you call and make a reservation when we need it. That is what is actually going on here.
Can anyone become a member of the club? Like, what
I
are
will
the
let Fred
membership
answer that question.
requirements?
We've talked to the people who are there, so they're going to be consistent with the professional community that's in the building. But we don't have any kind of other guidelines beyond that.
So I have a small business in Laconia. Can I
Yes.
become a member of the club? Can my business become a member of the club?
Yes, and that's exactly the scenario. This is built as a tool to help businesses in the community as well as ourselves.
Okay,
And it's
thank you.
primarily a business-focused clientele. That's the real world. So one of the neighbors asked, can the Concord Hospital Foundation use this for team building? Absolutely, yes. And that's an upcoming rental. That's a kind of thing that is the use of this building, and it's designed for that purpose.
That's really all that I have to say.
Any other
Are there
questions from the board?
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
With that, we'll declare the public testimony portion of the hearing closed, and I will invite the board to discuss the case. I think a summary is probably unnecessary, so I'll skip that. I think we all know what we're here to talk about. It's not news. So, starting with Ms. Spector Morgan, what are your thoughts? You got off easy last week.
I did. I appreciate what's being done and why it's being done and the greater good that is intended to be achieved. But what was presented to this board in conjunction with a request for reduced parking was that the fitness room, and we'll pretend for a moment racing simulators or fitness equipment, the fitness room and the meeting room would be used as accessory uses to the mansion. And it's not enough that that's what they're being primarily used for. There was no indication to this board that they would be used for anything else. And I think if this board had known they were going to be rented to the public, there may have been a different outcome, or certainly more of a discussion about the request for the parking variances, because having the businesses that are already there using the parking, using that space, is very different from renting it out to a third party. As for the apartment, there's no indication anywhere that that's going to be rented to anyone other than the intern. That is in there over and over and over again. So I think that the use of the apartment rented by a third party does violate the variances that were granted, and I don't think this board has the authority to allow them to keep their tenant in there. That's gonna be a code enforcement thing. So I would deny the appeal in its entirety.
In other words, you would sustain the
Correct, sustain the decision.
the
Yeah.
decision by the code enforcement officer.
Yes.
Nick, what do you think?
Yeah, and, it's very clear in the June 13th minutes, and I'll read the quote here. 3 or 4 large, there will be 3 or 4 live workspace. Some interns will be offered housing. The living space will not be offered to the public. I think it's pretty clear that what the intent of this board was when we granted that variance for parking on that issue. And as far as the community room, I always think of it, and as a board member, when I hear the word community room, although it may not be clearly defined in the zoning ordinance, I think of that as a room and a facility just to be used by the immediate area, the folks who are in the carriage house of the mansion and nobody else. I don't ever recall hearing it being available to the general public or select members outside that particular group. So I think that too is an issue for me.
Andrew?
Yeah, and I did go back and watch Dave got me a link, and I watched that June 2018 meeting, and I think all the representations were accurate, but the emphasis was, in terms of the variance for the parking, the emphasis was on the fact that this is high-end office use, therefore suggesting on a square footage basis, there wouldn't be as many people as you might suspect in an office based on the square footage, because the offices are bigger. And it was referenced that the live work is a basis for the parking variance because you're not double counting, you're not having a resident on top of the workers, you're having workers who are also living there, so they would only need one total spot. I understand the concept that, any kind of office use is gonna have it wouldn't be uncommon to say, let a nonprofit or even another business that you're friendly with use the conference, maybe a client or a vendor, someone use the office space periodically. That's pretty normal. I don't think, anyone would even notice that was happening. But I do think renting it out to the public as a separate business venture, and it is an RN district. I mean, we never granted that as a variance. And I don't doubt their accuracy of the fact that obviously someone in the city knew about this because it's in the mayor's report of 2019 that it does say some meeting and conference spaces will be available for rent by the general public. But the problem is, as I think others have said, when it comes before us, we don't have that. We're not considering that, and that becomes an issue of notification to the public, who then may have wanted a chance to respond. I mean, there is I can't remember the exact name of it, but there is a way to appeal. There is a basis for a variance based on representations of
Conditions of approval,
Yeah.
there's implied conditions of approval when representations are made to the board.
I don't think that. But also I think there's a way to get a variance if it's based on acquiescence by the city. But
Oh, municipal estoppel.
But that's
That's not us.
nowhere near met
Yeah.
here, and that's not even being requested.
Good,
So
because I don't know what that is.
it's come up before us like a couple times. But in any event, I don't think they would meet the standard for that because there hasn't been enough time gone by in any event. So I think if they were asking for variances, I would consider with open mind a lot of what Mr. Potter and his counsel has said. I mean, they could have very good arguments for variances for some or all of these things, but it would give us a chance to look at it more holistically and kind of circumscribe exactly what we think is appropriate to be going on there. But to say it's part of the variances we've granted, I think, it would not be accurate.
Can't argue with any of you. The record is pretty clear as far as what we heard, and it directly contradicts the suggestion that we approved something we thought was going to be rented out to the public. And I think the neighbors have concerns that need to be resolved some other way than us just saying, oh yeah, go for it. So I would be inclined also to support the ruling of the Code Enforcement Office. I think you could make an argument, maybe at some subsequent proceeding, that the apartment is a distinction without a difference, that there isn't any particular burden in this particular incident, but no one's made that argument yet. to us formally, and we have to decide whether it's legitimate or not. So I would support a motion to uphold the code enforcement administrator. I guess technically we're denying the request to overturn him rather than upholding him. Would anyone care to make that motion?
I will move to deny the appeal for the reasons discussed.
Is there a second?
A second.
It's been moved and seconded. Any other discussion?
The only thing I meant to add is I don't know if our opinion on this is really relevant, but I personally don't have any desire to try to evict, someone in the middle of a term, and if it's not bothering anyone, that code enforcement obviously has the authority on how strictly, to enforce that element of it.
I will work with Mr. Potter and to his, we'll work together on that.
I think it's a great project, and I really don't want to see it fail for some reason that didn't have to be. So I would keep an open mind on anything that came for us before, but in this case, I can't find a rationale to do other than vote in favor of the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? The ayes have it. The request is denied.
We do have 2 sets of minutes we could approve tonight.
We could, but in the case of the second one, I saw something in the minutes for Wednesday's meeting that caused me concern, and I spoke to David about it. And if I'm right, it should be changed before we approve the minutes. It's not a secret. What it was was in the Washington Street case, the way the minutes read, in order, a condition of the approval of the variance for the not having a handicap parking space.
Mr. Mato's pretty
Okay,
organized.
thank you. It says a motion to grant the variance for item number 5 with the condition that approval is received from the city for designation of an official on-street handicap parking spot was made by Spector Morgan.
I don't think it was approval, I think it was application.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a big difference.
Huge.
So that's, I get a sticker for my helmet for noticing that. Because we would have gone merrily along until someone read it and said, wait a minute.
Right.
So I have asked him to look at that again. Has everyone read the other set of minutes, the 17-page treatise?
I wasn't here.
I wasn't at that was for the July meeting, right?
Yeah, July, yeah.
I wasn't at the July meeting.
Okay, I was and Nick was, but I guess we can't approve it if there's only 2 of us,
I've got a copy of it. Let me see who was there.
because we got to have 3 for a motion.
Yeah, you were there.
You gotta have 3 to act on an application. I bet you could just have 2 to approve the minutes.
As far as I'm concerned, the
Yeah, it was Laura, Jim, you and I and Ted.
the July minutes were fine. What did you think, Nick?
Yeah, but I think there's only 2 of us, so we really,
Okay, so by popular acclaim, we approved the July minutes, and we'd like to take another look at the August minutes.
Yep.
Thank you. Is that it for tonight?
That,
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
give you all this.